Thanksgiving at my childhood home had always carried the scent of nostalgia, the rich aroma of roasted turkey, the sharp tang of cranberry sauce, and the faint sweetness of my mother's pecan pies. Yet this year, nostalgia came with a bitter undertone I could not ignore. I had returned from New York, where I'd carved out a life I was proud of, an executive role in a firm I had helped build, accolades and accomplishments that my parents had never acknowledged, much less celebrated. I had hoped that, at the very least, they might offer a hint of pride, a whisper of recognition. Instead, they had prepared their annual Thanksgiving pageant, and I was about to play a role I had not auditioned for. As I stepped into the grand dining room, every detail seemed amplified. The polished silver, where gleaming under the chandelier, the embroidered tablecloths, the careful arrangement of autumn leaves and miniature pumpkins. The guests were all seated, smiles poised, their eyes flicking curiously toward me. I walked in, expecting a polite acknowledgement, perhaps a nod or a smile. What I received instead was my mother's rehearsed introduction, dripping with false cheer. "And this," she said, gesturing with exaggerated flourish, "is our lovely maid, Emily." A hollow laugh echoed from somewhere deep in the room, as if the air itself were mocking me. I froze, my father's lips twitched, barely hiding his smirk. "Yes," my mother continued, "she's been helping us today, cleaning, serving. Truly indispensable." My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The maid, my hands trembled slightly at my sides, but I forced a smile, trying to anchor myself in composure. My parents, it seemed, were intent on turning my accomplishments, my independence, into a theatrical joke for their friends. My years of late nights, board meetings, business deals, and personal victories were invisible in the face of this humiliating masquerade. I scanned the room, expecting at least one sympathetic glance. Most faces were masks of polite confusion, some tinged with polite amusement. And yet there, in the corner of the dining room, near the fireplace, a pair of eyes met mine with quiet recognition. A subtle nod, almost imperceptible, a barely, their smile. It was a silent acknowledgement that I was not, in fact, a mere servant. My pulse quickened, a flicker of hope breaking through the sting of humiliation. Someone knew the truth. I took my place at the far end of the table, suppressing the urge to flee. The conversation flowed around me, harmless chatter about weather, politics, and trivial events, but I felt each word like a barb. I could almost hear my mother whispering behind her smile, delighting in the role she had forced me to play. "The maid, your daughter, Emily the brilliant one, reduced to servitude for their entertainment." Yet, beneath the shock and humiliation, a seed of resolve took root. I would not let this define me. I would not rise in anger, nor would I embarrass them in retaliation, not yet. There was power in restraint, in patience, in letting the situation unfold while I remained the calm, unbroken observer. I refilled wine glasses, offered cranberry sauce, and silently endured the mocking, half patronizing comments. Each forced movement, each polite smile, was a reminder. I could play their game, but only until the time was right. The one guest who had recognized me seemed to sense this shift as well. Their subtle glances gave me courage. Perhaps, just perhaps, I was not entirely invisible. As dinner continued, I felt the old ache of invisibility, the same ache I had felt in my parents' eyes when my achievements were dismissed, when my successes were met with envy rather than pride. But tonight, that ache mingled with something new, anticipation. I would bide my time, I would watch. I would wait, and when the moment was right, the truth would shine, not as a blunt weapon, but as a quiet, undeniable revelation. For now, I wore the mask of the obedient maid, serving wine and clearing plates, smiling at the guests' laughter that was never meant for me. But behind the mask, behind the carefully controlled gestures, my mind was already planning. This Thanksgiving, my parents thought they had humiliated me. Little did they know they had only set the stage. I moved through the dining room like a shadow, my tray of appetizers balancing carefully in my hands. Every smile I offered was measured, every laugh a careful echo of what was expected. But beneath the surface, my mind spun, replaying my parents' cruel introduction over and over. Our lovely maid, Emily. The words gnawed at me, but they were no longer enough to break me. Not entirely. It was then that I noticed the guest again, the one who had spared me the invisible shame of being entirely ignored. He sat quietly near the fireplace, an older gentleman with silver, streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much. I remembered him vaguely from family gatherings years ago. Mr. Harrington, a distant friend of my father's, a man who had always seemed to possess a kind of subtle authority. His presence had been understated then, but tonight, in the dim glow of candlelight, his gaze carried a weight I could feel across the table. He didn't call attention to me, didn't make a scene. Instead, he offered a small, almost imperceptible nod when our eyes met. It was brief, subtle, but it said everything without words. I know who you are. I see you. That single, quiet acknowledgement steadied something deep inside me. For the first time since stepping through the door, I felt the stirrings of possibility. I was not completely alone in this humiliation. I busied myself with small tasks, refilling glasses, passing bread, moving through the polite chatter and laughter that was supposed to distract from the awkwardness of my supposed role. My parents leaned into their cruel performance with ease, exchanging smug glances and expecting me to falter. But I had learned long ago how to conceal emotion, how to carry myself even when the world seemed to twist against me. As I placed a plate of roasted vegetables in front of one guest, I overheard a hushed conversation between two others. I could have sworn she was just a maid. One whispered with a touch of uncertainty, "No." The other replied softly, "There's something different about her, something you don't see at first glance." That was the spark, that was the thread I could pull. If even one person was beginning to notice, then perhaps the carefully constructed image my parents had created could unravel, without me raising my voice, without me breaking my composure. The idea thrilled me, a quiet, slow-burning excitement that mingled with the lingering sting of betrayal. I glanced at Mr. Harrington again. His gaze had not wavered, his eyes calm and unjudging, yet full of understanding. I remembered now. Years ago, he had quietly mentored me during a family event, offering advice I had then dismissed as polite niceties. Tonight, I understood. He had seen potential long before my parents had, long before I had even realized it myself. There was trust in his eyes, a silent partnership forming in the shadows. Throughout the evening, I began to play my role with deliberate precision. I laughed at the right moments, poured wine when needed, accepted polite thanks for trivial gestures. All the while, I observed. I watched the reactions, the tiny shifts in body language, the moments of hesitation when someone realized my movements carried more grace and authority than a mere servant should possess. I noticed the subtle disapproval flicker across my father's face, quickly masked by a forced smile. I felt the slight tension in my mother's posture when she realized I was no longer entirely invisible. By dessert, a quiet confidence had settled over me. I had become a ghostly presence at the table, visible, but controlled, measured, untouchable. Mr. Harrington's subtle glances had guided me, reminded me that appearances were fragile, and that truth had a way of emerging in the most unexpected forms. As I cleared the final plates, I allowed myself a moment to exhale. The humiliation my parents had orchestrated was not gone, but it was no longer suffocating. I could feel the beginnings of a plan forming, a slow, careful strategy that would allow me to reclaim my dignity, and perhaps in time, repay their cruelty in a manner that would leave no doubt about who I really was. The silent witness remained my anchor. In his quiet acknowledgement, I found the courage to endure, to bide my time, and to prepare for the subtle revenge that would not rely on anger or confrontation, but on precision, patience, and revelation. The game had begun, and I was already 3 moves ahead. Tonight, I had worn the mask they had forced upon me. Tomorrow, I would begin to remove it. The following days after Thanksgiving passed like a quiet storm. My parents, smug in their belief that they had humiliated me in front of our family and friends, seemed oblivious to the simmering undercurrent that I carried with me. Yet I was far from idle. Every smile I had offered at the table, every nod I had feigned as the maid, had been a rehearsal, a careful observation of weaknesses, habits, and expectations that I could turn to my advantage. It began with small things. I returned to the home office that my parents had always kept locked for safety and privacy, a room I had once been forbidden to enter as a child. While pretending to assist with organizing old family documents thankfully, a task my parents considered menial, I quietly reviewed the guest list from the dinner and noted every comment, every lingering glance, and every subtle interaction. Patterns emerged, which guests were genuinely perceptive, which ones relied solely on my parents' presentation, and which ones had been influenced by Mr. Harrington's discreet acknowledgement of me. By the next gathering, a small post, Thanksgiving brunch my parents were hosting, I had a plan. It was not meant to humiliate them publicly, that would be petty, but to reveal with quiet elegance that the maid they had laughed at was, in fact, a woman of accomplishment and influence. I arrived dressed in understated sophistication, the kind of elegance that spoke of quiet power rather than ostentation. My parents barely acknowledged my presence, still clinging to the joke they had begun. "Emily," my mother said, voice dripping with false cheer, "could you help set the table again?" I smiled, my hands calm and steady. "Of course, mother," I replied, but instead of bending to the mundane task, I moved through the room with ease, letting guests notice the subtle grace with which I carried myself. I engaged in light conversation, asking thoughtful questions about work and travel, listening attentively, and responding with insights that revealed depth and knowledge far beyond what any maid could be expected to possess. The shift was almost imperceptible at first. Guests began to notice that I spoke with authority, that my observations were keen, and that my presence carried weight even without ostentation. My parents' smiles faltered as whispers of recognition spread through the room. She's not what we were told." I orchestrated one subtle coup that brought the change into sharp focus. One guest, struggling with a minor dispute over seating arrangements, seemed ready to accept my mother's flustered directions. I stepped forward casually, offering a simple, elegant solution that aligned everyone's preferences effortlessly. The room relaxed, and the guest glanced at me with newfound respect, murmuring a quiet thanks that carried far more weight than any public declaration could. My parents' reaction was almost invisible at first, hidden behind their habitual smiles, but in their eyes I saw the crack, the awareness that their control over the narrative had slipped. I let it linger. I did not gloat. I simply continued to move through the gathering with quiet confidence, interacting, engaging, and subtly demonstrating the depth of my mind and the authority of my presence. Mr. Harrington, as always, observed quietly, a subtle nod acknowledging the effectiveness of my approach. His eyes met mine, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of an ally who had known my worth from the beginning. His presence reassured me that my measured approach was correct. True power, I realized, was not in confrontation, but in the revelation of undeniable truth. By the end of the brunch, the whispers had grown into murmurs of admiration. Guests who had doubted my status now spoke to me directly, asking questions, seeking opinions, and listening with genuine interest. My parents, once the architects of my humiliation, were now forced into passive observation. Their carefully constructed illusion had unraveled not through confrontation, but through the subtle unveiling of reality. As I cleared the last plate and returned to the living room, a quiet sense of satisfaction settled over me. I had not shouted, I had not demanded acknowledgement, and I had not humiliated anyone. And yet the truth, the quiet, undeniable truth of who I was, had emerged, reshaping the perceptions of all who had witnessed it. Sweet revenge, I realized, was not a matter of spectacle. It was the slow, deliberate unveiling of what had been hidden, a graceful assertion of dignity and authority. And in that subtle victory, I found more satisfaction than any loud confrontation could have provided. Tonight, I was no longer the maid. I was Emily, the woman my parents had tried to diminish, now seen as she truly was. And the knowledge of that, quietly acknowledged by all who mattered, was far sweeter than any insult I could have hurled in return. The next Thanksgiving arrived with all the trappings of tradition: golden turkey, warm pies, the scent of cinnamon and roasted squash filling the air. But this year, the atmosphere felt different. Not because the house had changed, or the menu, or even the guests. No, the shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it pulsed in the room like a quiet drumbeat of expectation. My parents, ever meticulous in appearances, were uneasy, their smiles brittle, their laughter tinged with a tension they could not quite hide. I entered with calm confidence, not the submissive poise they had attempted to impose on me the year before, but with the assured presence of a woman fully aware of her worth. I had spent the past year quietly strengthening my position, cultivating networks, and learning the art of measured, subtle influence. Every glance, every word, every gesture had been deliberate, and tonight it would all come together. Dinner began as usual. My parents, in a vain attempt to reclaim authority, made the same joke they had before. "Emily, our lovely maid, will help serve the guests tonight," my mother announced with a practiced cheer that now sounded hollow even to herself. I smiled politely, a mask of gracious compliance, but inside, a thrill of anticipation ran through me. Across the table, Mr. Harrington observed with his usual quiet authority. His eyes met mine briefly, a silent signal that tonight, the moment of recognition had arrived. And indeed, the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Guests who had laughed or averted their eyes last year now studied me carefully, noticing the subtle elegance in my movements, the poised strength in my posture, the articulate intelligence in my conversation. The cracks in my parents' carefully constructed illusion were widening. I began with a simple, controlled action. When my father struggled with an uncooperative wine decanter, I stepped forward and opened it effortlessly, explaining with casual expertise the proper technique for preserving the wine's bouquet. A murmur of impressed acknowledgement ran through the table. A guest leaned closer to Mr. Harrington and whispered something. I caught the phrase, "She's remarkable." Encouraged, I allowed the revelations to flow naturally. When a minor seating disagreement arose, I suggested a solution that accommodated everyone's preferences, including the often overlooked elderly cousin. My parents attempted to interject, but their words fell flat. The room, guided subtly by my actions and Mr. Harrington's approving nods, now acknowledged my competence without question. By the time dessert arrived, the atmosphere had transformed completely. Guests sought my input on everything from wine pairings to charity initiatives. My parents' attempts to regain control were met with polite deflection or gentle disagreement, their authority diminished not by insult, but by the quiet, undeniable presence of truth. I did not gloat. I simply existed in the space I had always deserved, and in doing so, allowed everyone else to recognize it for themselves. This at least moment of triumph came when Mr. Harrington finally spoke aloud, addressing the group. "I believe many of you do not realize," he said, voice calm but commanding, "that Emily is not only a guest among us tonight, she is a partner in several initiatives I've had the privilege to work on, a woman whose insight and leadership have shaped projects far beyond this room." A silence fell, eyes widened, conversations paused mid-word. My parents' forced smiles faltered, replaced by visible discomfort. The recognition that their daughter, the maid, was a woman of influence, respect, and undeniable talent rippled across the room like a gentle shockwave. I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me, tempered with the bittersweet knowledge that the victory was quiet, not triumphant in a loud, confrontational way. I had reclaimed my dignity, reshaped perceptions, and exposed the shallow cruelty of my parents' actions, all without sacrificing my composure or my values. Later, as the guests mingled and laughter returned to the room, I found a quiet moment with Mr. Harrington. He offered a small, approving smile. "You handled it perfectly," he said. "Subtlety is often more powerful than force. Your parents may never admit it, but tonight, the truth spoke louder than any argument." I nodded grateful, a mixture of relief and quiet triumph filling me. The mask of the obedient daughter, the maid, had been removed. What remained was the recognition I had earned, a presence respected, a mind acknowledged, and a dignity restored. As I looked across the room at my parents, still struggling to navigate the unspoken shift, I realized the final truth of revenge. It need not humiliate others overtly to be effective. It need only reveal reality, and that revelation, subtle and inevitable, carries its own quiet, sweet justice. Tonight, Thanksgiving had become more than a tradition. It had become a testament to resilience, intelligence, and the satisfaction that comes from reclaiming one's worth in a world determined to misjudge it. And for the first time in years, I felt entirely at peace.